because I will do this too. I'm going to speak about doing things under your own power and weighing the cost, and something that you may not have heard of. It's called life cycle analysis. Keep that in mind. Put that in the back of your mind. Life cycle analysis. This was a trial, and in most sham trials, the prosecution produces enough manufactured evidence to get a conviction. When the communists had a trial, they had what would be the verdict before it even started. People were persecuted or they were either tortured, a confession owed to the person, or they had held something like a family member and said, if you don't do this, you will be. And that silenced all objections. When it was tidy and neat and scripted, and it usually went all according to plan. Everything worked. Now, this trial didn't go quite that way. Eventually got through, but the problem was that above all, the person that needs to uphold the law is the court. Or what value it is there to have a court? Do you remember the story of Moses? He was sitting in judgment from morning to night, and his father-in-law, Jethro, came and said, this is not right. You need to fix this. And he said, you need to make lower courts, and you will be the final arbitrator, and when the lower courts can't decide on it, you will be like the Supreme Court. And so this court that was meeting to try Jesus was like the equivalent of the Supreme Court for the Jewish people. Of anyone, they should get it right. I've heard this story many times, and I suspect that in places it's true, but in small communities in the U.S., the police would set up a speed trap, and you would be coming along, and you would go through the speed trap, you'd be arrested, and you'd appear before the judge, and he'd give you a great big fine, and you knew that you'd had to pay the fine because if you didn't, something worse would happen. Now, they could get away with it. It was a small town, but you couldn't get away with that in the Supreme Court of the United States. Everyone was watching you. You had to do it right. Now, that was the same with these people. They had rules that they had to follow. They were put in place by Moses through God, and they had to follow them. They shouldn't have been able to get away with stuff that was wrong. I watched a made-for-TV movie 40 years ago. It wasn't much of a movie, and the gist of the movie was there was a reporter in an important newspaper, and he was well-respected, and he got an offer for a scandal rag like The Inquirer. They would want to hire you to be our reporter. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm a respected newspaper man, and you're not a respected newspaper. And they offered him more money, and they arranged for something to happen that he was going to lose his job. And now he was desperate, and what could he do? And they promised him all these things like, if you work for us, you only do real reporting, and it'll be truthful. And he took the job. And then the truth came out. He was the friend of an important official that was on his deathbed. He was dying. And they wanted a picture of him in his casket. And they knew that this would be a private funeral, and he would be there, and they said, you have to do this. You've got no other choice. And in the end of the movie, he's taking a picture of the guy in the casket, and he runs out. He's destroyed the friendship of a lifetime to do this. Now, the whole point of it was to say that most people won't do something horrible, but if you can break that up into little tiny steps, eventually they'll get there. There was a woman who became a Christian, and there's a program like Google or Facebook or something like that, on the internet, and you can post pictures of yourself, and people will pay to buy that picture. And this woman, she justified what she was doing by saying, I'm getting pictures of myself in my underwear, and people are buying them, and it's no different than if I was in a bikini. And what happened is, they would send her a message, if you do this, pose this way, I'll pay you $1,000, or I'll pay you $500. And what happened was, this is all baked into the system. The people who made the program knew that they would get more because they got a percentage. More money would come in. And after 2 months, she said, I had to stop. I didn't realize how far I would travel from the straight and narrow to get where I was. I had no idea. And the worst of it is, it's mostly young people who don't understand. Their mind's not fully developed, and then they've done all of this, and they made a lot of money, but they realize they're in a place that they didn't intend to go to. They'd never intended to get there. Now, it would be nice to say that the judges and the high priest and everything, that had happened to them. They never intended to get this bad, but that's not the truth. They were the company that was creating the mess. They had been doing this for years. They built the system. This wasn't their first crooked trial. And they'd been doing it for years before Jesus came along. And now they were going to do it to him. So let's look at this trial. Number one is Peter under his own power. Verse 53 says, they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. Now, you remember in the garden, if you look at verse 46 and 47, he laid hands and seized him, and one of them stood by, drew his sword, and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And if you turn over to John 18, verse 10, it says, Simon Peter, then having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave. Now what was happening is, that's quite a gutsy thing to do. You know, here he is, he's 600 people, 600 soldiers, trained and armed, have come to arrest Jesus, and he pulls out his sword and he starts the battle. Now, by every right, he should have been killed. He's just one guy. He's a fisherman with a sword. He's not Samson, and that these are not Philistines, and he's not going to kill 1,000 of them with the jawbone of an ass. He's going to get killed. And if Jesus hadn't stepped in, that's what would have happened. In verse 6 of John 18, it says, and he said to them, I am he. And they drew back and fell to the ground. So make no mistake about this, Jesus was in complete control of the situation. It wasn't as if the 600 men with the swords was in control. No, Jesus was in control. And in verse 11 it says, of John 18, it says, and Jesus said to Peter, put the sword in the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? He was saying, they have no power over me. I'm the one in control here, and if I decide to give up, then that's my decision. And the soldiers knew that he was in control. They had just fallen to the ground from words that he spoke. And they would probably have trouble getting up and drawing upon enough courage to continue what they were doing. And so, Peter, after this, in this verse, had made his way following the soldiers and came right into the courtyard and sat with the soldiers at the fire. How did he know that the soldier he was sitting beside wouldn't have been one that was standing beside the the servant of the high priest. Hey, wasn't it you that just cut that guy's ear off? He didn't know that when he went in. So I thought, that's pretty gutsy. So what was this, you ask? Here he used the sword, and now he was in harm's way. What was he up to? Well, it was a brave act under his own power. He was redeeming himself in his own eyes. His ego would not accept that he'd lost that contest with Jesus and he'd done exactly what Jesus had said he would do. He would run away. And so, if he was really wanted to do what Jesus wanted him to do, Jesus said, I'm in control, this is mine, the cup that the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? And if he was thinking about that, he would have said, well, Jesus is in control, he's chosen this decision, if I want to be part of that, what am I going to do? Now, he only had a moment to decide while these 600 men gathered up the courage. And this is what he did. He ran away. Did exactly what Jesus said he would do. And now he's gathered up some more courage, and he's sitting at the fire, and he's just made it possible for him to deny Jesus 3 times. Well, so that's Peter under his own power. This is what he's accomplished. Number 2 is, this should have worked. By all rights, this should have worked. It's verse 55 says, now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding any. For many were giving false testimony against him, but their testimony was not consistent. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. But even in this respect, their testimony was inconsistent. Now, they've been planning this for months. We've all read all of that. That they were looking for somebody to betray him. They were planning to kill him. They wanted to do it at a certain time. They had witnesses ready. All of this was ready. And now it had fallen, all the puzzle pieces were in place, but it looked like they were amateur hour. Nothing was working for them. And the rules are, 2 witnesses have to agree, and they couldn't. They couldn't get their lies straight. And so the court is supposed to just look at the evidence. It's not the job of the court, like it said in verse 55, they were kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus. It's their job. When Moses was sitting from morning to night, people would bring him the court case, he would look at it, and he'd make a decision. It wasn't his job to go out and find it. Now, you might say, well, no, Peter, these people are looking after the country, and so it's under their jurisdiction to find out if people are causing an insurrection and bringing the country to the point of war. And so, yes, they could very well check out on Jesus to see what he's doing. He's getting a great following. Is this going to be trouble? All that's true, but once he was brought to the court, then they have to take off that hat and put on the hat of a judge. As judges in a theocracy, they're acting on behalf of God, and they're bound by his laws. And it was a noble and honored task, and if they stepped past the boundaries set up by God, they were in open defiance against him. Now the rules were, some of the rules at least, were that 2 or 3 witnesses had to agree, and if they didn't agree, then there was something going to happen to the witnesses. they were going to be punished in exactly the same way as the one that was on trial. But you know that none of that happened. But at the very least, they should have let him go. Even if they didn't punish those witnesses that were lying. Now, there was another thing that they talked about, that they said he was going to tear down this temple and build another. And Jesus did say that, but he didn't say it exactly the way they said it. They kind of massaged it into another, to sound like he was talking about Herod's temple. And I always thought that was funny. Isn't this God's temple? No, this is Herod's temple. Now, another thing that screamed out stop in the name of the law was doing it at night. It was never supposed to be done at night. And Jesus was supposed to have the opportunity to call witnesses in his defense. He was supposed to be able to say, well, no, that's not the way I said it. Here's the people who heard it. You see, they were doing their best to serve God under their own power, and you see how all of that went. At the very best, you could say, is when they were young and naive and they were starting out to serve God, and little by little, the compromises added up until they were doing their best to kill God. Number 3, help. We're in trouble here. Verse 60 says, the high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? But he kept silent and did not answer. And again the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, these people had a code of honor. You've heard that crooks have a code of honor. You don't, and they had a code of honor, and they wanted this to have all the appearance of a fair trial, and it wasn't working. The witnesses had failed to come through, and now they had to break down and ask Jesus for his help, as much as that would have bugged him. I was listening I travel around for Apex sometimes to go to a job site and check things out, and I was listening to a sermon on the radio. And the speaker was speaking on this very subject. And he said that in Jewish law, if somebody was going to be tried on, the court wasn't allowed to go on a fishing trip. Now, a fishing trip is where you're going somewhere you're not supposed to be. In computers, it's spelled PH instead of F for fishing. It's PHISHING. A fishing trip is where they're trying to get you into a con. Now, I've fallen into these cons before. Not a bad one, but a con nonetheless. And what happened was I was looking for a van for my daughter because their transmission had went, and I was looking at a certain cost, and I found this great van at a super duper price, and I sent an email off, and I never got an answer. Wanda looked at a motorhome, and there was a motorhome for sale in St. John and a motorhome for sale in Halifax, and they both had the same email address. What they were doing is they were collecting emails. These people would send them emails, the computer program would assemble these, and they'd sell them. And so then you'd get an email from somebody trying to sell you something, and they'd say, how'd you get my email? It's a fishing trip, fishing experiment. Well, the Jewish court says you cannot, if somebody's brought in for stealing a sheep, that's what you look at. You don't say, I'm going to see if he's doing something else wrong. I'm going to find something else wrong that he's doing. No, you look at and see, they brought Jesus in, and they had charges against him, and the witnesses had failed to be able to agree, and so what should have happened is they should have said, okay, sorry, We're letting you go. Now, there are times where people can trick you, and it's okay. Somebody was telling me about a club in Moncton that forever people were underage were going there to get into the club. And you pass them your ID, the bouncer would take the ID and he'd look at it and he'd say, "What color's your eyes?" And the person would say, "Blue." But the card here says yellow or brown or whatever. They hadn't studied the ID, so he tricked them. And that was fine. He stopped somebody from coming into the club that wasn't supposed to be. But that was not what the Jewish court was supposed to do. They had things that they had to do, and they couldn't go around them. They had to listen to the witness, call them out if they disagreed and couldn't agree, and apologize to Jesus and let him go. Instead, they said, he's a good and godly man, and he'll tell the truth, even if he knows we're going to use it against him. So let's break all the rules and get him any way they can. If not, all of this planning goes out the window and we hate to fail. Well, number 4 is success with the help of Jesus. Verse 63 says, tearing his clothes, the high priest said, "What further need do we have of witnesses? We have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you?" And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Some began to spit on him and blindfold him and beat him with their fists and say, "Prophesy." And others, the officers, received him with slaps in the face. Now, whenever I read this, I thought to myself, when Jesus said in verse 62, "I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven," I always thought that they would see that as blasphemy. But I was reading the commentaries, and they said, that's not true. To call that blasphemy in their culture, in the way the words were said, it was a stretch. It wasn't really blasphemy. But this was too good a chance and an opportunity to let pass. And so everybody else that wasn't learned would think, well, of course, yeah, that's blasphemy. We can sneak this past. They were happy to bend the law to get what they wanted. I see this all the time in the corporate world, where the people who sold cigarettes wouldn't tell you that they did a study that showed that people die from smoking cigarettes. And the people that sell beer, you haven't seen as pretty women and as good-looking men as drink beer. But that's not true. People that drink a lot of beer have a bump in the front. But you don't see that in advertising. They hide those truths. The company that sells vaping, that's the pretend cigarettes, they put flavor in them, but the flavor is poison, and they know this, but they still sell it. I was listening on the radio. They're going to not allow them to do it in New Brunswick. Well, that's what the high priests were doing. Close enough for horseshoes and hand grenades and sham trials. They were going to convict the God who created everything. And so now that they've done it, and they've gone, phew, we're done it. And they said, well, we're going to punish him for making it so hard. And you see that they hit him and spit on him. No, it's kind of in for a penny, in for a pound. But what's the conclusion? Well, count the cost of what you do. Look at everything under the magnifying glass of God's Word. If the religious leaders had, they would have worshipped Jesus. And at the very least, they would have let him go. The trial would have ended differently. The other thing is you have to consider the facts. I was having a discussion at work. Somebody thinks electric cars are the greatest thing. And I'm probably going to convince all of you to go right out and buy an electric car. And he said that they have zero emissions. And I said, well, wait a minute. What about if you using electricity created by a coal-fired generator? And so I did a little research, because I was arguing without knowing for sure. So CBC did this thing and said, if you drive a gas car, this is how much carbon you put out. And if you drive an electric car that uses electricity generated by a coal-fired, this is how much carbon you put out. It's almost the same, 9/10. But it went on to say that if you drive an electric car that's produced by wind power up this hill, it's zero. And I said, that can't be right. So I did another study, and I said, look, I looked at the study, and it said 5 million pounds of concrete goes in the hole to hold that up from falling over. And that means 5 million pounds of crushed rock and cement, and the cement has to be mined, the lime has to be taken to a mill, and it has to be heated to 1400 degrees, and then you have to dig a hole of 8 million pounds of soil and put the concrete in and then fill it back in and cut trees and all that stuff. Must create a lot of carbon. And it does. But they said, because it's not near as much, it's 10 grams per kilowatt hour for wind power and 1,500 grams for coal power. So, as Adrian has said, that when he talked to them, it takes 20 years to pay for all that concrete and steel. It's 1.8 million pounds of steel and 90,000 pounds of plastic to make that windmill. But, as far as carbon output, it only takes 6 or 7 months. So I said, oh, I guess I'm wrong. It is zero almost. But the problem is, there's other things that if you don't have a windy day, you don't have a windmill that's turning. There's other factors. But all of that to say that I was wrong and I learned. So that explanation is to say, well, how did they come up with that? Well, they did a life cycle analysis. That's where you come up with all those figures. And so that's all to say that we need to do the same thing with the claims of Jesus. You can't just say, yeah, he was a great teacher and move on. No, you need to do a life cycle analysis. Peter failed to count the cost of his plan to save Jesus. In the end, he did exactly what Jesus predicted. He denied him 3 times. The chief priests and the leaders of the law, who were running this trial under their own power, they didn't figure out what this was going to cost, and in the end they did the worst travesty of justice in the history of the world. As we drove up here from Moncton, every person we went by has to take into account what their idea of salvation is. Is it my idea of salvation, I can do this myself? Or is the idea of salvation something that Jesus has to do? Now, only one will work, but either way you're going to get a perfect trial before Jesus. He'll either say, come into the glory I prepared for you, or depart from me, you workers of iniquity, and go to the place prepared for the devil and his angels. They need to do a life cycle analysis on what they believe about Jesus, because it's more important. I did this about wind power, and I decided I was wrong. But it doesn't really matter compared to what Jesus said he was doing for us. What salvation means. The stakes are really, really high in that department. And I wish that, and this is my desire, that God will give me an opportunity to say to somebody, you know, this is more important. You can't find anything more important than what Jesus did for you. What is in these words? that are in the Bible that have been saved for us changes everything. That's why we have communion. We recognize that all of this is true, and we have communion so we don't, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Oh yeah. No. God doesn't want us to forget about that. He wants us to remember. Let's pray.